Alrighty, so this is part one of module two, Conquest and Colonization. Um, in our discussion of conquest and colonization, I do want us to talk a little bit about the indigenous people of Florida. Um, these are, of course, the Native Americans that were here prior to Spanish conquest and even during Spanish conquest. Um, and we need to understand a little bit more about them in order to understand why the Spanish um, could be considered successful or unsuccessful in terms of their mission system and their colonization process. But mostly because they are Floridians, and Florida history is about all Floridians, not just starting with colonization. So, as evidence, we have evidence today in a number of different ways. The first one we're going to talk about is the shell rings. Shell rings were elevated, basically rings of earth. Usually, the foundation of them was shells, but it could also be earth. It could be whatever was plentiful at the time, and shells, of course, were plentiful because most native populations lived near the coast and they used um, seafood as their main portion of their diet. So the map in the upper left shows you all the different locations where shell rings have been found. Focusing on Florida, you see Guana, which is located along A1A between Jacksonville or Ponte Vedra in St. Augustine. There is Iguana State Park that has a shell ring, at least one that I know of. And then you got a couple up near Jacksonville as well, Rollins and then Oxeye. And then you've got others that are located in the southern part of Florida, but again, around the coast. So what did these shell rings provide? What was the purpose of them? As you can see in the picture at the bottom, it's an elevated area, so it would be, in terms of spatial relationship to the gods, you're at a higher level. So it means that people who are considered more in touch with the gods would live there. Also ceremonial buildings, so if you had, most native populations would put, if someone died, they would have a place to put their body before it was buried. Um, and so that hut where the body was stored may be located there. You may have some sort of priest or chief that lives that you didn't want on the basic level with everybody else. He had status, he had power, and so therefore he belonged on top of the shell ring. So it was about spatial relationships between average people and the gods. So the closer you were to the gods, um, the more status and more power you had, and therefore this was a way to express that. Sounds as they're a common thing, what we most associate with native populations. Um, and the map in the upper left again shows where a number of those are located. Um, Several in the Panhandle, obviously, but more in the center part of the state, and then along around, kind of around Tampa Bay, a little bit further south. But again, mostly coastal, mostly, but not always, as you can see. The picture at the bottom is of Turtle Mound, which was located around Daytona Ormond Beach. You also have a picture of an island, what looks like an island, and that is a massive mound that exists in Florida Bay. So it wasn't unheard of for native populations to create man-made islands, which would serve as ceremonial grounds or some sort of religious or cultural significant structure. So the chief may live there, and it may have been a paramount chief or someone of high status who lived there as opposed to living within the village. Another piece of evidence is Miami Circle. Those of you who are familiar with Miami, this is down at where the Miami River meets Biscayne Bay. Henry Flagler built a hotel on top of this, and there's these great pictures of workmen building the hotel, hauling away all of these shells. So, there wasn't a great deal of effort made to preserve any of this, unfortunately. But we do have now a park that's located down at this point, and you can see what that looks like. Um, what the purpose is, we're not really sure. The connection between Stonehenge has been made, that this is some sort of, you know, astrological, that's what I'm looking for, structure. Um, but it certainly has created a great deal of interest among archaeologists. So what's significant about these cultures? What we really are looking at, and what helps to differentiate these cultures, because we don't really know what people call themselves. So it's very hard for us to say, well, the people who live in Tampa Bay were the so-and-sos, and that's what they refer to themselves as, because we don't have any written records. If we have any written records, it's probably an account from a Spaniard. And so you're not really sure if they got everything right, if you know what I mean. But the evidence is what we use in order to differentiate between one culture and another. Pottery is a wonderful way to do this. Pottery basically represents a distinctive environment. So the clay, the water, the plants, all of these things, the plant material gets caught in that clay. And so scientists are able to determine what plant matter, what type of sand, soil is located within the clay once the pot is examined. Decoration is also distinctive because in many cases, what separates one culture from another is the fact that their decorations vary. You may have wavy lines in one culture and then kind of a basket weave pattern in another. So it's very distinctive, and it seems to be that many of these cultures wanted to have that distinctive nature. So you could have, if they were trading goods or trading pottery, they would be able to identify their own pottery. And people would be able to trade specifically with them if they wanted to, for example. The rise of agriculture is another part that becomes very important because usually this means that cultures become less nomadic and more sedentary, that they're more likely to stay in one place. No, maybe not always, but at least they're not completely nomadic. They have villages and camps that they utilize. It also means that population increase is potential. That once you grow crops, the natural reaction is to have a population explosion. That's at least what happens, in the early history of man. When we have the agricultural revolution, there is a population explosion. And along with agriculture comes the change of village hierarchy or leadership. Usually you have to have some sort of centralized control, and that usually means the creation of a chief or the elevation of a chief, and then usually some sort of elite group, um, whether it's village elders or a priest or a group of priests, something to that effect. Cultivation of maize is very important when we talk about native populations because it usually means that they have interacted with another culture that is growing maize, and they learned the techniques for growing and cultivating maize. This means that you have more defined gender roles, that women are more focused on agriculture and domestic duties, and men are more focused on hunting. Trade, again, pops up because the spreading of maize usually follows trade patterns. And then you also have the rise of a more solid hierarchy of leadership, meaning that if you already have a chief, typically there comes along with maize this elevation of a paramount chief. So you may have 3 or 4 chiefs in a certain area, and one of those is considered to be the leader of the others for whatever reason, usually because they're um, wealthier or because they have some sort of power or status brought on by cultivation of maize, and that they're trading and receiving goods from outside their area. So Mississippian culture is very much tied to the cultivation of maize. In all of the societies where Mississippian culture had an influence, you find corn. What's interesting, and we'll talk about this in a second, is how corn and cultivation of maize um, kind of, I wouldn't say skips Florida, but it has a interesting correlation. The northern part of Florida, as you can see in this map, sort of does begin to grow corn, and we have evidence of that. But then, as you go a little bit further south to the middle of the state and further down all the way to the southern tip, not so much. You still have the rise of paramount chiefs. You have all of the indications of an influence with Mississippian culture. We have evidence of goods coming from as far north as areas like Michigan and New York in Florida, but there is no corn. And we talked about this in the last module about how the soil is so sandy in many areas of Florida that it's not able to grow a great deal of products such as corn. And so that kind of aids in this differentiation as well. So as typical with Mississippian culture, you have mounds. Mounds are very distinctive in terms of Mississippian culture. It's, you know, if you travel around the South, you will run into mounds everywhere. Florida was very much a part of this as well. So again, we have evidence that points to the fact that Mississippian culture was made inroads into Florida, but there are some changes to that, of course, the cultivation of maize. The Crystal River site is considered probably one of the best from an archaeological standpoint, but you also have what they call Mound City, which is toward the interior part of the state. If you look at the map of the mounds, I think it's 2 or 3 slides back, you'll see right around Palm Beach there are red dots towards the interior part of the state, and that's what Mound City is. So it's connected some way to river systems for trade as opposed to ocean. Again, pottery. What is pottery used for? Well, if you look at these 4 examples of pottery, you're thinking, well, you know, maybe they used it to hold, I don't know, some sort of commodity, corn or seeds or something to that effect. But you notice that they're decorative, and they're decorative in different designs. Each of these different designs represents a different culture, and we'll put names with the cultures in just a second. But why would you differentiate between, or why would you have different designs like this? So you got 4 different cultures, 4 different designs. It could be the soil that you're using, you know, what's in the clay, the plant material, and all of that that's in there. Typically, they're mimicking what they see. So it may be, you know, the picture of the bottom right has kind of wavy lines. Maybe they're closer to the ocean, and so therefore this is their interpretation of water. You know, we don't really know. But we do know that certain patterns of decoration are distinctive to a particular culture, that all of their pieces, or most of their pieces of pottery, fall in the same decoration pattern. So that is how they differentiate between the different cultures. Obviously, we don't have any written records where they call themselves, you know, such and such. So basically what archaeologists have done is said, well, this is indicative of St. John's culture because they're near the St. John's River. They all share the same type of pottery and decoration in their pottery. So we're going to call them all part of the St. John's culture, for example. So that's when we look at the different names for the different cultures, that's how they differentiate between them, is by the type of culture of pottery and the decoration that they're using. Maize is native to the Americas. It derives of the teosinte plant, which is in the bottom left. It shows you what the teosinte plant looks like. And the picture in the upper right is the plant, a modern image of it. So how do you go from that teosinte to modern corn? Well, this is where the idea of native populations being much more advanced than we give them credit to comes in. Over the centuries, Native Americans selectively bred this teosinte plant with other plants in order to get it to hybridization, or basically to get it to the modern plant. So over time, it begins to resemble more closely to what we look at in terms of modern corn. So why would they do this? They learned that corn was a very highly effective food, not necessarily in its natural state, but for the most part, it was very nutritious and it provided a great deal of energy. The problem was that if you didn't, what's the word I'm looking for? It was all in the preparation of the corn for eating. So you would strip the corn from the cob, you would soak the corn in lime water, and lime water would add niacin. And niacin was a much needed ingredient into corn, because if you strictly just ate corn, without doing this process, which they call nixtamalization, which is basically the soaking in lime water, you would eventually develop pellagra, which was a disease, I believe, of the joints. So there was a consequence of eating corn without learning this. So, in other words, Native Americans over time developed this process by learning that corn suffered from this issue. And so they needed to find a solution, and they did. So usually the corn would soak overnight, and then you would prep it to be eaten the next day. We see this process in Latin America with the metate. The metate it looks like a mortar and pestle, but it's where basically the corn is ground up and then prepared to be eaten. And you can make tamales, you can make tortillas, all of these things. But it did require that overnight soaking in lime water first. So how did corn become a part of the native populations? Through companion planting. Corn provided a support for the other crops that were eaten as well. So the stalk served like a post or a stick, where it would support the vines of other plants, specifically squash and beans. Squash was domesticated first. I think it is a Native American plant. And what it would do is it would be planted and grown, and it would serve as a cover for the ground. So you didn't have to worry about weeding. It blocked sunlight to weeds and other plants. It was also like a living mulch. So it would retain the moisture within the soil, which kept the nutrients intact. Then you planted the maize, which would be the support, the stalk itself would be support. And then beans would be planted next. And the beans provided nitrogen back into the soil. So it was basically a way to preserve your soil and not have it become, devoid of nutrients within a few planting seasons. You could grow crops for many seasons there before the soil would give out. They did use fertilizer, rotten fish or eels buried with the sand, with the seeds would provide fertilizer for the plants. So that was also something else they learned. But you see all these pictures on this page that indicate their use of crops, of the plants. So starting on the upper left, you've got a sack made out of corn husks. You've got a mask below that was used, that comes from the corn husks. You've got a mat next to that that would be used for sleeping, and that was made out of corn husks. The picture above that is the gourd that could be used for water. It could be used for storage. Next to that are shoes that would have been made out of corn husks. And then, of course, you've got pipes and rattles that would be used for ceremonial uses that were coming out of corn cobs, and then, of course, the gourds from squash. And then you have dolls that were usually made out of the corn husks for children as well. So how does maize and Florida connect? Okay, so here's the thing. Florida is an anomaly, which, if you haven't learned that so far in this course, you will learn that. Florida kind of is an outlier on everything. But what we see in northern Florida is the use of corn, mostly around the areas where the northern Timucua area, and then where the Appalachians lived around Tallahassee in the Panhandle. The soil there was more conducive to growing corn. And so therefore the Indians and Native Americans living there would grow corn, cultivate it. And they learned this through their connections with the Mississippian culture. Further south, especially along the coast, as we talked about in the last module, the soil is sandy. It doesn't produce a great deal of productivity out of agriculture. So Native Americans kept to their major diet, which was, of course, seafood. And so shells kind of point to that. The shell mounds that we find along the river and along the coast all point to the fact that seafood played a major role in their diet. However, we still have evidence of strong central leadership. So even though you don't have corn, you still have the effects of centralization, control within the native populations, and the growth of chiefdoms. So you still, excuse me, have that evidence, but without corn being there. The other evidence, too, points to the fact that we have archaeological evidence, items that have been found in digs where the origin of these products, whether it's pottery or metal, indicates widespread trade. Widespread trade. So the origin of the items might be New York. It might be somewhere in the Central Plains, Illinois or Michigan. It's definitely outside of Florida, and it suggests that there was widespread trade going on. Dr. Ashley at UNF has been studying some of the Indian mounds along the St. Johns River in basically downtown Jacksonville, just a few miles away from UNF. And it seems that these tribal areas, or these land, which we have found the mounds for, we found these settlements, were centers of trade, and they were trading goods for hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and they have found evidence of that. So trade was certainly much more widespread than what we have originally considered. So the importance of the chief, how does the role of the chief emerge? Obviously what you find within the native populations is very similar to what we find in early man. The rise of agriculture means that you have to have some sort of centralized control. Who's going to tell people what to do and how to do it? And that relies upon a chief. Throw in religious and spiritual aspects of it, and you have a chief who um, may claim that he can communicate with the gods, and therefore he has this status due to that. How are chiefs selected? Most of the evidence points to matrilineal descent, which means chiefs are selected by their relation to the women, not to men within the tribe, which is something else that kind of throws Spanish explorers, because they're used to the patrilineal system where its passage comes through the men. But women seem to have a great deal more power. And that points again to the agricultural system, because in many cases, early societies connect agriculture to women and giving birth to children, that there's a correlation between the two, a cycle for both, and fertility and kind of sexual reproduction seem to mirror each other. So there are different periods. There's the Paleo Indians. These are the early Indians. An example of this is the Osceola River Prehistory Project, which we'll talk about in a second. Early Archaic period, middle Archaic period, late Archaic period, and then post-Archaic period. And at the end of post-Archaic is, of course, European contact. The map on the right shows the sea level changes. And so this points to something to consider, that 10,000 years ago, rivers in Florida, the rivers that we know, maybe the St. John's, wasn't there. Maybe it was, it only went a certain distance. So we have to keep all of this in mind as we're looking for evidence of, even Paleo Indians or early Archaic, that landforms change, especially water. The sea levels seem to have risen over time. So what might have been, a valley or a depression within, the middle of the state now has become a lake, because water has intruded into the area because of the higher sea levels. So you have to be ready. And we'll have an example of one such site. Yes, the Wendover Pond site, which is kind of an interesting aspect. So post-archaic cultures, these are the cultures that, again, archaeologists have looked at pottery type and location. Specifically, the pottery type lends itself to location because of the soil type. So you've got St. John's people, as I mentioned, those are people who live along the St. John's. The Deptford culture, Swift Creek culture, Wheaton Island culture, Cades Pond culture, and so on. All of these seem to point to different types of pottery and different types of decoration, which seem to suggest they are completely different cultures. Some branch off from each other, like the Wheaton Island culture produces the Cades Pond culture. There's some similarities, but they're different enough that they warrant to be called something else. So keep that in mind as we talk about this. Over time, these cultures will consolidate, and this is where we start recognizing the names that we attribute to Native Americans. So the Choctaw, the Creek, the Appalachee, the Miccosukee, the Timucua, Calusa, etc. They consolidate into cultures, and they begin to define themselves, or at least seem to combine under chiefs, common chiefs. The Calusa, for example, when Menendez comes to Florida. He has interactions with the Calusa, and they have a paramount chief system where there's one chief that Pedro meets with and you know interacts with because he's the most powerful. But then there are chiefs underneath him, um, and so you still have this system that is very much kind of the continuation of the same sort of leadership. So why do these cultures develop? How do they consolidate, and why do we why do they seem to kind of gravitate to certain places? Well, if you think about migration, the Creek are a great example of this because they will eventually become part of the Seminoles. What the Creeks do is they migrate based on their complete disdain of the American government and Americans in general. They leave Georgia and Alabama area and move to the south, into the south or middle part of Florida um, because the British had taken over Florida. And so during the British period, we see this mass migration of Creek Indians into the area around Gainesville. So to them, that's an external threat that they've just gone through a series of wars, the Creek Wars, against the United States and the settlers who keep moving into their territory. And so they figure, you know what, let's just get the heck out of here. And we'll go somewhere where we know we're going to be treated fairly by the British. Of course, what they don't realize is within about 20 years, they're now going to be under the Spanish and eventually the Americans again. So it doesn't last. But regardless, you have internal threats. So some groups will pull away from another group because they side with a certain leader over another. Trade is another heavy what am I trying to say? Reason for consolidating. Trade is very important to the native populations, even prior to European conquest and contact with Europeans. Trade is the lifeblood of the community. Environment can play a role in this. As we were talking about, with higher water levels, I mean, it's not going to happen like immediately, but over time, things change. Maybe the land isn't as productive as it used to be, and so it requires them to move to a different part of the state or to a different part of the South. Chief centralization of the power within the chief. The chief begins to call the shots, and maybe he moves the people away, or maybe he combines different populations together. And then the tribute chiefs as well, the paramount chief and the tribute tribes, the ones that are underneath paying tribute to this paramount chief. I included maps also of Georgia and Alabama. Obviously, Alabama will become important when we talk about the migration of the Creeks into Florida. We've got a couple more modules before then. But Georgia is interesting because you've got the southern edge of the Timucua and the Appalachia there. And then the Wale and the Yemassee play a big role within Florida history. And so I wanted to go ahead and kind of introduce them. The Wale, it is spelled with a G, but it is pronounced Wale. And the Yemassee obviously looks normal, but they're not the Guale, they're the Wale. So always remember that. It's my little tidbit of history for you. So Paleo Indians, what do we know and what are we getting from? This is the Osceola River site where they found a mastodon's tusk. What's interesting about the Osceola River is recently archaeologists have had a dig where they suspect that the Osceola River site is actually older than the date that they have established Indians crossing the Bering Strait. So in other words, there were Indians in Florida prior to Indians crossing into North America from Russia, crossing the Bering Strait. It's kind of thrown that whole date thing into a tizzy because they're not really sure how that was possible. So the only thing that makes sense at this point is that they think that a group of Indians came by water. Where they came from, no clue. Um, but it does seem to suggest that they didn't all cross the Bering Strait, that they came from somewhere else. So kind of stay tuned for more developments, I guess you could say. The Wendover Pond, this is an interesting site. The bottom left shows you what it looks like today. This was dig done in the late 70s and 80s. And basically, it was somebody who got a backhoe and decided that they were going to expand this lake, and they dug into, they took the backhoe and went to dig, and they uncovered a skeleton. And so they have found a number of skeletons located in this pond um, that were buried underwater, which is kind of an interesting aspect. That I guess if the water table is so high um, that you have to find some way to bury people, and I guess the only way to do it is bury it in water. I'm not sure how they came about with this, but anyway, this site has been very, very important in terms of shedding light on the early Archaic period. The Bluffton site is the Middle Archaic period. This is a house that's been built on top of the image of the house, built on top of a mound, which I don't think the house is there anymore, but it seems to suggest that, again, you have people moving into the territory have no idea what they're moving into. So to them, it's just a hill, but really and truly, it's archaeological evidence. So today it is, I believe, a park or a state park, and it's being preserved. Interesting name, Horace Island. This is San Marco Island to the poorer one of us, because San Marco Island is a private island for the wealthy. There's a bunch of condos and big houses. It's down by Fort Myers. But Mr. Hoare, Horr, had a house, and so the bottom left shows you the picture of what's left of the house, the ruins of the house. But they have found shell mounds surrounding, and these are kind of the image that you see in the right. So shell mounds and seem to indicate that this is the late Archaic period, and so you have some burials underwater, but the fact that they have found a number of mounds with archaeological evidence that seems to point to how people were living, what they were living off of in terms of diet, and the connections between themselves and the other communities that they're trading with. So again, we have widespread trading. So why is this important to understand Florida history? Again, I think what it comes down to is we have to understand how the environment impacted these people, what they lived off of, how they survived, what their diet was, and how they made a living. It certainly will play a big role in terms of colonization, especially when you have the Spanish in St. Augustine, who literally are starving to death, and the only way that they can survive is by trading with the Indians. So it helps to indicate that in many cases, the layer of trading that the Indians and Native peoples have established, the Spanish just kind of overlay that whole network with themselves. And so they kind of plug into these existing networks of trade that really go throughout the entire North America. So it is kind of an interesting development. So hopefully this helped, and I will continue with part 2 of this module in just a second. Keep in mind, these are normally when I'm in a standalone class, I have 2 PowerPoints that are 70 slides each. So this is why I'm having to kind of divide it up into 4 groups, because it's just a lot of information, but a lot of useful information. So anyway, hopefully this helps, and stay tuned.